What is up, GUFF gang? Joey Marino here from Grown Up Fantasy Football, giving you my top 5 lessons learned from this past fantasy football season. Hey, if you're new here or if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button down below and like this video if you enjoy it. Check us out on Twitter at GrownUpFF. We're also on Facebook, Grown Up Fantasy Football. Let's get into the video. All right, so my top 5 lessons learned from the 2020 fantasy football season. Number 5 is the rookies won't always be this good. So we had an incredible rookie class this past season. Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow were studs while they were playing. Jalen Hurts was possibly a league winner. Even Tua had his moments during the season. Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, Jonathan Taylor all came on at the end of the season and were fantastic for you. Justin Jefferson was a wide receiver 1 this year and rewrote the record book for the Vikings. Brandon Ayuk, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, all of them had their moments too. And the only position that didn't really produce was tight end, but go figure. And what caused this to happen? What was the reason behind these rookies just kind of showing out? They didn't have an offseason. They didn't have a preseason. Did the vets just not have time to adapt? Or was the game just different? Were COVID protocols something to do with it? I'm not really sure, but whatever it was, I don't necessarily see this happening again. These rookies, it may have just been a really talented class. I don't see this happening again next year. Now, there's some very talented rookies coming up this year, but I just don't know if we're going to see this kind of production from rookies going forward each and every year. Don't let this tempt you into thinking one of your rookies is going to explode. Now, they very well could, but the chances are very unlikely. Number 4, a new team isn't always a fresh start. So I'll start with the most obvious person who left his former team to a new one, and that is Tom Brady. Now, if you haven't already seen Zach's video on Tom Brady, go check it out, but I'm sure that you'll be pleased to hear that James and I do not share the same sentiment about the GOAT. Tom Brady took his team to the Super Bowl. Yeah, okay, it is a fresh start for him. He was fantastic this year. He was a top 5 fantasy quarterback. But there's a couple other guys who didn't really do as well on a new team. Todd Gurley, for example, went from the Rams in a very friendly system to Atlanta, which is a very pass-heavy offense. The opportunity, we thought wouldn't really be there for him because it's such a pass-happy offense. But from weeks 1 through 9, he had 9 touchdowns for you. He was pretty great. But right after that, he fell off a cliff in terms of yardage. He was doing terrible on the ground. He was only getting like 1 to 2 receptions a game. He didn't get like any touchdowns after that, and he ended up getting benched. That's terrible. Another guy is Robbie Anderson. Now, it's not as severe as what happened to Todd Gurley, but at the beginning of the year, Robbie Anderson, came from the Jets. He broke free of the Adam Gase curse, and he was in the top 5 of receiving yards for the first quarter of the season. But as the season went on, CMC wasn't there to take up some of the passing work, but Mike Davis sure took some, and DJ Moore started getting more and more involved, started building rapport with Teddy Bridgewater, and Curtis Samuel got more involved. Robbie Anderson kind of lost some target share and lost a little bit of fantasy relevance to where, you were really questioning starting him in your lineup. So that's something to keep in mind this year. We got notable free agents like Deshaun Watson, he's not a free agent, but he is trying to get traded as of right now. Allen Robinson's another free agent to look at. There's a lot of guys who are hitting free agency and hitting the market. So pay attention to what team they go to, what kind of opportunity they may have, what share they may have in targets. It's something to look for definitely next year. All right, my number 3 lesson I learned from last season is to plan for the playoffs. Now, it's definitely one thing to get a good team assembled, but you want to make sure you assemble a team that has good playoff schedules. And I'm not talking about necessarily at the draft because you don't really know what's going to happen during the season. But make some trades, make some moves. There's guys like Aaron Rodgers, Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, David Montgomery, all had incredible playoff schedules. They were gold if you had them during the playoffs. You want to make sure you trade for guys about 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks into the season, when you start to figure out the matchups and start to see what's trending. You figure out who you want to trade for. Then there's guys who didn't really have a great playoff schedule, but they were still really good. Alvin Kamara was one. He was fantastic, but his 6 touchdown game was an anomaly pretty much. Dalvin Cook was another stud who, he ended up sitting out, I think, week 16 or 17 with a personal reason. So if your last half of your championship was week 17, then you didn't really have him. But he was still a stud. But make sure throughout the season you're looking towards the playoffs. You're trying to get to the playoffs, win your championship. Definitely pay attention to see who's trending the right direction, who has the best schedule coming up, and who doesn't have a great schedule in the playoffs. Like, try to ship off Todd Gurley before his schedule falls off a cliff, and try to get someone who's trending up, like a Jonathan Taylor, Cam Akers, one of these other young guys. But try to definitely build your team and assemble your team for the playoffs. Number 2, good matchups aren't always as favorable as you think, and bad matchups aren't necessarily as bad as you think. What I mean by that is, you see defenses. Let's take San Francisco for an example. At the beginning of the year, they lost pretty much everyone to injury, and you could pretty much stream a quarterback against the San Francisco defense and have moderate to high success. Now, once the season went on, obviously they had a great defensive coordinator, Robert Saleh, who was able to turn it around, and their defense really stepped it up, especially in the run game. Seattle was another example. As the opposite. They were pretty terrible to start the year. You could do whatever you want to that defense. But at about halfway or a little past halfway, they started getting a lot better, and they're playing a lot better. Yes, the competition wasn't as good, but that counts for fantasy. So some of these matchups may not be what you think they are. Tampa Bay was dominant in the secondary to start the year, and then they dropped off in the later half of the year. So it's something you definitely want to pay attention to, is the matchups may not be as bad or may not be as good as they seem. And my number one lesson learned, from the 2020 fantasy football season is to be patient with players. Yes, I know fantasy football is all about making trades, making deals. I make trades. Everyone makes trades. You, me, whoever makes trades. But some guys you may want to be a little bit more patient with. Take a look at Lamar Jackson, for example. He did not have the best start to the season. He didn't have the same start as you thought he would, possibly, as he did last season. Now, where you drafted him could have been in this first or second round. The ROI on that wasn't as great. He ended up being in the second half of QB1s on the season where he finished, but it was the end of the season that really stuck it out for Lamar Jackson. If you stuck it out with Lamar Jackson, then you really had a dominant quarterback come time for the end of the season, getting into the playoffs and into the playoffs. You had a great quarterback with terrific matchups. Hollywood Brown was about the same, super inconsistent all year. He would score you 15 points one week. The next week, he'd goose you. But once that schedule opened up for Baltimore, Lamar and Hollywood were absolutely dynamite. Brandon Cooks had a late season resurgence. T.Y. Hilton had a bounce back at the end of the season. Some of these guys, are worth holding on to. Not necessarily studs. Derrick Henry, he may have, a couple of games where it's not what you're expecting, but he owns the last quarter of the season. He owns the fourth quarter of the season. So he's definitely somebody you got to hold on to. Then there's guys that you want to get rid of. James Conner, Todd Gurley, Devin Singletary was not a guy that lived up to expectations that we thought he would. Tim Patrick kind of fizzled out somewhat due to quarterback play. But the lesson is to be patient with players. Yes, it's always good to test the market, see what you can get for these guys, but some of these guys you just want to hold on to. And, if they have a very favorable schedule opening up, then definitely hold on to those guys. But that's going to do it for my top 5 lessons learned from the 2020 fantasy football season. Comment below what you think of my lessons learned. And if you have any more lessons that you've learned through the season, put them down below. I'd love to hear them. Be sure to follow us on Twitter. Check us out on Facebook, Grown Up Fantasy Football, and subscribe down below if you enjoy this kind of content. Be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to grow up, and be sure to get guffed.